to one and all. Welcome to those listening in on our live stream. Welcome to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. My name is Adam Shoemaker, and I have the privilege of serving as the rector, the priest in charge here. And we are very happy to welcome you to this monthly evening lecture. This evening's lecture will be offered by scholar Harlan Greene on the LGBTQ history of Charleston. Mr. Greene has written a new book, The Real Rainbow Row, and copies of his book are available for purchase. Following our lecture, all are welcome to join Mr. Greene for a reception in Stevens Hall, which is to the left of our office suite, and then you turn left into our courtyard, and you can just follow folks into the hall that way. But before we welcome Harlan, please join me in a moment of prayer. God of community, encompassing all that was, that is, and that can be, who brings to birth each precious being in your creation, we thank you for our capacity to love and for your love poured out on all of us. We thank you especially for the LGBTQIA community here in Charleston and ask your blessings upon them and upon us this night. And we ask this all for love's sake. Amen. Amen. With that, I invite forward Harlan Greene.
So, wow, thank you all for being here. I'm happy to be here to celebrate something, and I'm not going to say I'm celebrating the book or I'm celebrating myself. I really do want to celebrate with this community story. Bing. And with no preamble, I just want to say this community has been here since before the beginning. You see the slide there too, and again, going right into it, long before Carolina was settled, the Spanish and French settlers coming through the southeast found people that we would say were gender fluid, they did not know how to deal with these people who did not fit to our sexual stereotypes. Hermaphrodite was the only word that Europeans had to try to conjure with these people. And so then, frankly, this is one of the very first images of indigenous people that went back to Europe, talking about these strange people that they saw, men who acted like women. According to the Spanish, it should only be women who were taking care of the sick, but these are obviously men. So this community has been here longer than just about any other one. And if you wanted to go to 1670, when we actually do, chart our history, the founding here, I don't have an image, but I do have an example. Florence O'Sullivan, who was on the very first ship, one of the very first Europeans to set foot here in Carolina. We remember him as being the namesake for Sullivan's Island, but we do not remember him for being the first person being accused of being a buggerer, which was the terminology at the time of any person who did not fit sexual stereotypes. So from the very first beginning, on the very first ship, buggery and someone that we would call LGBTQ today was here from the very beginning. And the fact that he is not remembered for this, the fact that he is not honored for this, is one of the things that pisses me off. And don't piss me off. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that I wrote this book, is because this whole history has been omitted from books, has been omitted from our story. And so then that is one of the things that goaded me to this, the fact that he was not honored and not remembered. Another thing that makes me angry, and I can start a lot of things like that, is you might remember in 2006, there was a big flack in the South Carolina State House when posters appeared on the London Tube trying to lure tourists to the United States, LGBTQ tourists in particular. So there were banners that said, LA is so queer, so gay, New Orleans is so gay, everything was so gay. And there was one that put up there that said, South Carolina is so gay. So apparently the Tourist Commission in Columbia had put up $5,000 for it. The State House was horrified that someone could ever suggest that LGBTQ people had ever been in South Carolina, were in South Carolina, or were even welcome in South Carolina. And so that person was fired. And again, as I said, that's another thing that made me angry. So for over 300 years, as I said, this community has not just been denied a place at the table, we haven't even had a place on the library shelf. And so the premise of this, and what I'm going to go through on this PowerPoint, is basically to try to talk about no, LGBTQ people have been here from the very beginning. So hold on to your hats, because I've got 300 years in about 45 minutes or something like that. So I talked to you about Native Americans being gender fluid on the very first ship, a European, and then we'll go to the next slide. As I say, the Inquisition begins. You can't read the red. But in 1712, we have not secured our borders. The Native Americans are attacking us. We're fearing the Spanish. But for some reason, we feel compelled that we have to write a law saying that since there is no law against buggery so far, we now have to condemn it. And so then this law on the books, 1712 until 1868, will put LGBTQ people to death, will deny them any kind of use of clergy, et cetera, et cetera. While we don't know of any example of an LGBTQ person put to death for his or her crimes in South Carolina, this is enough to put, sorry for the pun, the fear of God in you, that if you know that you can be put to death, so obviously this starts the historian's problem. Everybody is hiding things, and so then leaving very little for us to find. So if you wanted to survive, the message comes in the law books, you have to hide your true self. So the next slide. Just moving rapidly right along, we can see LGBTQ presence in the American Revolution. Y'all have seen, many of y'all I'm sure have seen the Broadway hit Hamilton, and it does talk about it is called a love affair between Alexander Hamilton and John Laurens. We know specifically that Alexander Hamilton was smitten with John Laurens. His family over the years, tried to censor their letters because Alexander Hamilton was so enamored of Laurens. So they both serve under General Washington. Laurens comes back to South Carolina trying to convince the white elite here to actually free African Americans so that they can fight against the British with us, since there are more blacks than there are whites. He is turned down. He dies soon after in a minor skirmish, and Hamilton is bereft. And as we say, he does actually, the family does censor his letters. And I'm not making this up, historians have been dealing with this love affair between the two since the 1970s or so, when people started putting on their glasses and started actually seeing what was in the text. And the next one, too, and again, next slide. Charleston is also very proud of Francis Salvador. This is the monument in City Hall Park, the first Jew to be elected to public office in North America, and the first Jew to die for American independence. Like I said, Charleston Jewish community, the revolutionary community, is extremely proud of Francis Salvador. And again, it's not me, it's other historians that are actually now looking at Francis Salvador's life and seeing he was much more intrigued with men than he was with women. He leaves his family behind in London, never communicates with them again. He follows a man from London to Carolina, a man named Richard Rapley. They do not settle in Charleston. They settle on the frontier, away from anyone else. So Salvador is killed in 1776, again, the first Jew to die in the American Revolution. Richard Rapley never marries. When he dies in the 1820s, they all talk about, how he preserved the memory of his intimate friend, as they called it there. So again, now we're actually seeing, that again, another hero of the American Revolution might be someone today that we would classify into that category. I have found at least one Charleston serviceman in the War of 1812, and in the next slide, 1812, sorry about the segue, is about the time that this building that we know as Ashley Hall is built. And if you actually go, and again, this is the kind of thing, we actually have to go to deeds and wills and dry documents like that to try to parse out a history that has been hidden from us. But if you actually start looking at those deeds and documents, so the home is built by Patrick Duncan. It is known as the Nicholson, it is now known as the James Nicholson House. So if you actually look at the relationship between Duncan and Nicholson, they never marry, They live in the same house together. They're known for growing their roses on the, on the property. And when one of them goes back to England, when one of them, Duncan wills the house to Nicholson while he is still alive before it goes to his quote, blood family. The same kind of thing that we would be doing today is sending it to your, the law would not allow, because, his lover was not his next of kin, so he is doing that legally. So again, even with documents like that, we have to resort to that to parse out our history. And so the next slide. So the interesting thing about them is we have, it's really hard to find women and African American history in this history as well. Women in particular, you ladies, you're always on the column. The Southern womanhood always put on a column. So the law of buggerer was not accused. Women were never accused of that. Women have no sexual desire. So women are kind of above the law and are hidden to that. And again, as we all know, I always think of history as kind of an elite white man's club. And it's always been an elite white man's club. And at one point, African Americans got allowed in. At one point, women got in. And this is us knocking at the door to get LGBTQ people in. But anyway, so I have found some women in Charleston before the Civil War, and they're just going to have to stand in for the many ones that I can't find anything about. So Ada Agnes Jane McElhenney. You can see on this image here, she's born in Charleston. She's got short hair. She does not like the image. She does not like the role that has been prepared for her to be a proper Southern woman. So many in this congregation might feel pride that the city of Charleston took down the Calhoun Monument in 2020. So this woman was why the Calhoun Monument was not built in the first place, because Calhoun dies in 1850. Ada is a relative of John C. Calhoun. She has known him. So when the ladies put together money to build a monument to John C. Calhoun after Calhoun's death, she steals the money. And she goes off to New York to claim her own personality. And that's why that monument is not built for another 30 years, until the 1880s. But in New York, she reinvents herself as the Queen of Bohemia. She carries on affairs with men and women, and one of her best friends is Walt Whitman, who is no slouch, and obviously, and she hangs out with gay men, and so then here is someone, again, that we can be proud of. Parse her, she did not believe in Calhoun, she did believe in slavery, she wasn't perfect, but she went to New York to claim her gender identity. And the next slide. So Rufus Griswold and Charlotte Myers Griswold. So Charlotte, and the larger image, she would have loved nothing she did not love scandal the way Ada Clare did. Ada Clare courted it, loved having it. Charlotte was meek and retiring, but unfortunately, because of what her husband did, she ends up in the scandal sheets all over the United States. So she's born in Georgetown, South Carolina, to a Jewish family. She is raised in Charleston. She has the unfortunate thing of meeting Rufus Griswold. Rufus Griswold, a footnote to American literary history, Rufus Griswold is remembered as the man who destroyed Edgar Allan Poe's reputation. Griswold was a terrible, terrible compiler, anthologist, and when Poe died, he convinced America that Poe had left him, Griswold, as Poe's literary executor, and it was Griswold who made up all these stories about Poe being debauched, Poe being opium addict, et cetera, et cetera. So Rufus is on the lookout for a wealthy woman. Charlotte crosses his glance in Philadelphia. He asks to marry her. They get married. They come back to Charleston. The marriage does not go particularly well. She gets her property back from him. Rufus's eye, and he's a reverend on top of this, Rufus basically says he wants a divorce from Charlotte. South Carolina does not sanction a divorce until 1948, but he basically forces her to sign a particular document. He's actually kidnapped his daughter, which Charlotte has been raising, and she can only get his daughter back if she signs this document. She signs the document. Rufus uses this as an excuse to get a divorce in Philadelphia. Charlotte reads that Rufus has gotten a divorce. She sues, and Rufus has gone ahead and remarried someone. She says he is a bigamist. The courts actually show that he never did get a divorce. He made it all up. But then in the court of public opinion, what Rufus then does to this woman here in Charleston is he says, by God, God is my witness, I did not need a divorce from Charlotte. No man or God would have ever sanctioned a marriage because it is as if I was married to a person of the same sex. He's basically saying that Charlotte was something that we would call intersex today. We have no idea if that was true or not, but this was, like I said, a story that was carried in all the antebellum newspapers, and from what I'm told, it's still quoted by divorce lawyers today. So poor Charlotte lived on the streets of Charleston, and we don't know how people treated her. The next slide, we do have someone who unfortunately did not stay long in the city of Charleston. Anna Brackett comes to Charleston right before the Civil War. She's from New England. She teaches at Meminger School. And she's one of the last Union people to leave the city of Charleston right before the blockade starts. And so then what she does do, she goes on to be the first woman, the head of a high school in the United States of America. She's very pro-civil rights activist. She and her partner, Ida Elliott, actually adopt 2 daughters in the late 19th century. And these women together end up fighting for women's rights and civil rights. And they, we talk about the Grimke sisters from Charleston being some of the first people thinking of women's equality. Anna Brackett and Ida Elliott were that way too. And we made a big boo-boo in that war. And this is another reason we made the mistake, because if Anna Brackett had stayed here after the Civil War, there's no telling what she might have done. So the next slide. So before I leave the Civil War, again, I have to go back to another Jew, not from the city of Charleston, but who lived in the city of Charleston. His father, Philip, was one of the founders of Reform at Congregation Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim. So Judah Benjamin, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, Attorney General of the Confederacy, does grow up in the city of Charleston. He's the only member of the Confederate cabinet who is not caught. He makes it to England, where he reinvents himself as a barrister. And so, but he destroys all his papers because it is known that he is a gay man. So not only is he going to England and changing his country, he's shedding his skin of being a gay man as well. So again, some very nationally prominent people in the Confederacy lived in Charleston, LGBTQ. And he's the only, this is a Jeopardy question, the only Jew on an American piece of currency is Judah Benjamin on the Confederate $2 bill. So next slide. And so then after the Civil War, this is the irony here, so it's after the Civil War that we first get our glimpses of what may be African American LGBTQ history. And again, one wants so hard to find this. But so for complicated reasons, in almost all cities in the United States after the Civil War, all of a sudden these municipal laws come into being of people of outlawing cross-dressing. It is now against the law for a man to appear in women's clothes and against the law for women to appear in men's clothes. And so we go to the police records, and unfortunately a lot of our history is written by our oppressors. We go to the police records and we find a series of African American men in women's clothes arrested all around Marion Square, which is where the federal troops are garrisoned here until 1877. So we have glimpses of a possible sex industry going on, and we're starting to get the first names in a little bit of the life stories of some African Americans. And what moves me about this is that we have men who were born into bondage. They get their freedom, and then they get their freedom to start expressing their sexuality as well. And one wishes that one could celebrate these people more, find their names, and broadcast them, but we can't. And the irony is that Judah Benjamin goes to England and hides his sexuality, and he believes strongly in slavery, and these enslaved people are doing the reverse. So next slide. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde obviously becomes both sort of the poster boy. There's Walt Whitman in America. There's Oscar Wilde, in England for, for the love that dare not speak his name. Oscar Wilde visits the city of Charleston in 1882. The newspaper sort of makes fun of him because of his clothes. And again, people are very curious about how people dress. They know they're onto something. If you're not wearing a gender-appropriate clothes, you're under suspect. So when he's actually on trial in 1895, again, all the local newspapers lambast him, and then a reporter, after he's already convicted, and the newspapers never say what he's convicted for. They never mention it. But after he's convicted, a newspaper reporter goes to the libraries in town, goes to the bookstores in town, and tries to see if anyone has ever been interested in Oscar Wilde's books. And the librarians say, no, no one has ever checked out an Oscar Wilde book. The bookstore said, no one's ever wanted to buy an Oscar Wilde book. And so then Charleston feels morally smug that they are above this. No one has ever been interested in Oscar Wilde. So next slide. And then the next thing, 4 years later, they realize that the vice that they think is over across the ocean has crossed here. This newspaper article appears in 1899. When I first saw it about 20 years ago, it truly astonished me, because what it's saying is that a vile resort, a white man is feared that his grandson has gone astray. He calls the police. The police run to a vile resort on Wentworth Street, not far from here, between King and Meeting, and it is a male bordello where black men and white men meet for sex. And people are so astonished by this. They call it the French vice. You know, homosexuality always has to come from somewhere else. In the 1960s, they'll talk about outside agitators coming to stir up African Americans. It's always coming from somewhere else. Of course, there could never be any native-born kind of activity like this. So the interesting thing is the black men are arrested, they're shamed and named in the paper. The white men are not named, and they get off scot-free. But as I say, for about the first time then, people are actually reading in the News and Courier that there is gay activity on the streets of Charleston, and it's crossing color lines, which must astonish them as well too. And in 1913, the city founds the Law and Order League. They want to close down all the blind tigers, all where the illegal liquor is sold, and they want to close the bordellos near Meminger School. But there also is a short little paragraph in there about perversion, saying that there's more perversion in the city of Charleston than people would know, and this time it says it's come from Chicago. And the interesting thing is, an Episcopal minister, Methodist minister, is giving a sermon, praising the Law and Order League, and he actually starts talking about the Greek vice. He's basically saying, that Christianity is the best culture because we do not tolerate that. So the thought is, that someone in church before me today actually talked about LGBTQ stuff in the city of Charleston. And this, I think, was kind of crossing a Rubicon as well, too. If now you can say it out loud in church, in front of women and children, then people know that there is this, this incredible vice going out there. And so LGBTQ people who always had to be on the down low now even have to be more on the down low because people are out there looking for suspicious activity. It's now been broached their consciousness that, that kind of Oscar Wilde kind of sin does exist. So next slide. So Laura Bragg, who I was very honored to know, mentioned in the newspaper this morning about leading the Charleston Museum, etc. So she's born in 1888. She comes to Charleston in 1909, and a little belatedly, she brings the 20th century in with her. She opens, she's head of the museum. She integrates the public library. She does so much. She mentors so many people. Robert Furchtgott goes on to win the Nobel Prize for ultimately what creates Viagra. And she really mentors so many people. She changes so much things. But her sexuality is not suspect because she's a woman. So because that she's living with a series of other women in the city of Charleston, they just think she's a spinster, two spinsters living together that can't find, a man for them. But Laura Bragg is truly responsible for helping to bring on the Charleston Renaissance, this flowering of arts and culture, waking up the sleeping beauty of Charleston and kind of leading to the Charleston that we have today. The next slide. And again, so I write a lot about the Charleston Renaissance, and we always left out the LGBTQ people who were in every age of the city. There's always been LGBTQ people involved. And we can look back at the Renaissance, this time between the two world wars, and see it was too. It's so interesting that Edward Mickey, a black man, helps find the NAACP. A gay black man is one of the founders of the NAACP here in Charleston in 1917. He can actually find his group among black people. He cannot find his group among gay people, so he goes to New York. His sister Ellen is a lesbian as well, and she's kind of kicked out of the city of Charleston too. She has fired a gun at a minister who is married to one of her girlfriends. So she's quickly gotten out of town as well too. Someone that I don't have an image of are basically, I think, two black women who obviously had a Boston marriage, who lived together. Josephine Hull de Prelo is only the second doctor in the city of Charleston. She's African American, born here in 1866. I wish I had an image of her. She lives forever, for years, with her nurse, Beulah Crawford. And together they have the Better Baby Bureau. They take care of black single women, and they're really outspoken for their community. And when people go to do black history in the city of Charleston, even at the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture, a few years ago, when they do a history of all the black doctors in the city of Charleston, Hull de Prelo is forgotten. I do have an image of the next person, African American, Edmund Thornton Jenkins, the son of Reverend Jenkins of the Jenkins Orphanage. He again has to leave the city of Charleston. He goes to Paris and London. He's on the verge of a brilliant career, both as a formal classical composer and a jazz musician, and he dies tragically young in his 20s. A few years ago, the Spoleto came here. They revived his work. They're so proud of Edmund Thornton Jenkins. They're leaving the little bullet out of his bio that he was gay. The books do not talk about it, but the family members have confirmed to me that indeed he was gay. So so there's black contributors to the literary renaissance. There are white contributors, and as many of us here are familiar with Alfred Huddy and Elizabeth O'Neill Verner and all of the etchers who come out in Charleston at this time period, who really start representing the city of Charleston, through this efflorescence of culture. It truly is the etching that takes images of the city beyond itself and starts making this a tourist city and making this a haven for artists. And yes, the books do talk about Ellen Day Hale and Gabrielle D. Clements, best friends, aka lovers, and they are the ones who they meet. They're both from New England, although Gabriella DeVoe Clements is actually related to Frances Marion. They meet abroad in Paris, where the Académie Julienne, where women can take classes. They establish a household together. They winter in Charleston, and they are the women that bring etching to the city of Charleston. They specifically set out to teach Elizabeth O'Neill Verner and a variety of other women and Alice Smith in the city of Charleston the art of etching. They changed the city of Charleston, and again, they too have been kind of forgotten and written out of history. Next slide. So moving right along, coming up to World War II. World War II is bringing thousands of LGBTQ men and women into the city of Charleston. One of them is a young man named Melvin Dwork, who actually is at Parris Island. He's considered a candidate for officer training school. He's brought up to Charleston to the medical university, and they open his mail. They find he's been writing to his lover in New Orleans, and they arrest him, and they put him in the brig here in Charleston. And he is, so he is drummed out of the service for being, he's one of the few gay soldiers in the city of Charleston that is found out for his sexuality. As it says on the bottom, he is a trailblazer to some extent. He's the first one to get his World War II dishonorable discharge overturned before he dies in his 90s. And he does end up actually being one of the best decorators in America in the 1990s or so. Next one. And World War II, again, I was very fortunate to know Edwin Peacock and John Ziegler. Many of you here may know them as well, too. Edwin Peacock comes to Charleston before World War II. He knows this little girl in Georgia named Lula Carson Smith, who eventually becomes Carson McCullers. He actually, mentors her. She uses Edwin as one of the characters in her first novel, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. So Edwin and John have met in Charleston right before World War II. They go off and serve together. They come back to Charleston, and they found the book basement on the corner of Greene and College Street, now on the College of Charleston campus. They are an out gay male committed couple. They belong to the NAACP. They allow, all races, colors, and creeds in their bookstore. And again, they end up being mentors to a whole generation of gay youth in the city of Charleston. Gay Citadel cadets can go there. Gay College of Charleston students can go there, feel at home there too. And it's also kind of the gay Underground Railroad that the famous LGBTQ people who come visit in the city of Charleston visit John and Edwin as well. So moving right along, we think things are getting better, but Charleston is a military city, and in the 1950s, we talk about the Red Menace and the Lavender Menace. That homosexuality is kind of conflated with being a security risk. Communism is sapping American manhood, etc. So unfortunately, we have an example of this kind of thing playing out here as well. So on Halloween, 1958, a man named Jack Dobbins, who lives in this little pink house on Queen Street, goes to Club 49. This is actually a superimposed image. The building is no longer standing on King Street. He's a bartender there. He picks up a young man who shall not be named. They go back to Dobbins' house. Dobbins makes, quote, a move on him. The murderer has the keys to the front door in his pocket. Instead of leaving, he runs upstairs, gets a candlestick, comes downstairs, beats Dobbins, steals his money, goes back to the Air Force Base, and brags to his friends. The next day, he reads the newspaper that Dobbins has been killed. So he turns himself in. His friends perjure themselves and say, no, he did not tell these stories. He goes to court in December of 1958. And the judge demands, we need a ruling. I don't want to go to bed without a ruling. 8 minutes later, the jury comes in. They say, of course, they set the murderer free. And there are cheers in the courtroom, teenagers giggling and stuff like that. And what happened is before he was tried in court, the court of public opinion in the newspaper basically condemned Dobbins for being gay. They never said the word. They talked about his murderer being a clean-cut young man. Dobbins, however, was a veteran of the Korean War as well, too. But they talked about, he liked antiques. He didn't have girlfriends. He went to the Gibbs Museum of Art. And they got him for sleeping on lavender sheets. I kid you not. So that was in the newspaper. And I have talked to men who, as young boys, heard this story and made a beeline to get out of the city of Charleston because they knew being gay, they were not going to be protected. And the next slide talks about one in particular. Leonard Matlovich is an Army brat. He's at the Air Force Base. He's about 15 when the Candlestick murder happens. He's at Bishop England High School. He knows he's gay. He goes undercover. And what he does to fit in, he becomes a racist because that's how you fit in the city of Charleston. You're not the lowest rung of society by being a queer boy if you can pal around with your friends who are picking on black people. So he does do that. He joins the Air Force. He actually starts coming out of his racist beliefs in the Air Force, so much so that the Air Force sends him all around the country teaching workshops showing how stupid racism is. Then he gets the brilliant idea that if racism is stupid, homophobia is stupid as well too. So long before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, he writes a letter to his commanding officer and he comes out. And this is going to be the test case in 1975 as to whether LGBTQ people can serve in the military. And he has bounced out on his ear. But as it says there too, he is the first out gay person on the cover of a magazine in 1975. And in a very odd roundabout way, we in Charleston made him what he is. Granted, it was a negative way, conflating racism and homophobia, but then coming out above it. And about the same time, and the next slide, basically just born another year apart from him was Armistead Maupin, who many know. Armistead Maupin's born into this very conservative milieu in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's actually in the service here in Charleston, South Carolina, the Navy base. And again, in the 60s, they'll say it's all these Navy people bringing queers here. They're not homebred. Armistead actually comes out in the city of Charleston for the very first time, has his first sexual experience on the Battery. He goes back to Vietnam. He comes here, works for the newspaper, And when he leaves, he goes to San Francisco and writes this famous series of books, The Tales of the City. And, for the younger people here, before Ellen and before Will and Grace, Tales of the City was what really normalized LGBTQ people, showed that, yes, gay people are just like you and me. They pay the bills, they have rent, etc. And it really is a phenomenally popular success. And Armistead goes on record, and hopefully there's no spoiler alert, God gave you fingers to stick in your ears if you don't want to hear what I'm going to say about Armistead's book. One of the major characters in his book is Mrs. Madrigal, which is an anagram for man and a girl. And Armistead goes on the record of saying that crucial character in his series of 9 books is based on Gordon Langley Hall, who comes here into the United States as a man, gets, sex reassignment surgery in 1968, becomes national news, and then that actually influences Armistead Maupin for this great cultural event. So what we see going on here, and Dawn herself becomes quite a lightning rod for issues of racism and homophobia and trans issues as well. But what we see now going on is Charleston is actually creating, people that have passed through Charleston are actually creating national change on the thing. And as I say in the book, Charleston is not an island, we're a peninsula, we're still slightly connected to the mainland, and we can't avoid all the main currents crossing America. And so then Charleston belatedly starts catching up with issues and trends as well too. So we go to the next slide. So the Spoleto Festival coming in 1977 really does change things. Not that it's just done by, run by Giancarlo Menotti, a gay man, but truly the festival is actually almost sidelined because the wealthy people of Charleston have gone to Italy, to Spoleto, Italy, to see what it's like over there, to see a festival. They are shocked. They see all these degenerates running around, being, in the festival. They come to Charleston, they pull their money out of the festival. They do not want, again, degenerates coming to the city of Charleston. And so then, but ironically, the Spoleto Festival actually does do that. It actually does start attracting more open people to it. And specifically, I'm sure many people here, I know people here, have been to the King Street Garden and Gun Club. So Dick Robeson, the man on the right, as you can see there, he came to Charleston to be the box office manager. He opened the King Street Garden and Gun Club. And it's hard to believe that a nightclub could really have had social impact on the city of Charleston, but indeed it did. It was the very first time that I always think it was like geological strata. There were all these different strata. The Gun Club was the earthquake that actually brought everybody together. So you could see, black, white, queer, straight, everybody was together, and it truly was the very first melding. And as I say there, it was one of the very first times it was cool to be queer in the city of Charleston, and it really was to some extent coming out. And following that thing, again, the next slide, coming up further and further, closer and closer, the press in Charleston is founded in 1732. It's not until 1981 that there is a gay publication in the city of Charleston. And so much of this change has been brought by outsiders, people who've been moving to Charleston, who come from a larger world and larger ideas. Some people here may know George Holt, who's more known for his now, his new design thing, doing small houses on very small scale, very elegant scale. The new Byzantine construction. George is born in Madrid. He goes to the College of Charleston. He takes a job in Chicago, and he realizes, oh, there are gay newspapers out there. So he comes to Charleston, starts the first gay newspaper in 1981, and you don't know whether he's starting this or he's actually just figuring out what's going on. For the very first time, George is basically saying, there needs to be a community ethos in the city of Charleston among gay people. Bars are not it. We need something else. And whether he's making it happen or he's just happened to be witnessing, all of a sudden his little newspaper starts filling up with events. All of these groups are now being founded in the city of Charleston. MCC comes to the city of Charleston. There's something called Lambda. There's something, all these social groups, men's groups, women's groups. And as I say at the bottom, which I guess you can't read, so now all of a sudden it's not individuals anymore. Institutions are being founded in the city of Charleston. And the next slide, and I promise to get us up to the 20th century. So the irony is just as the community is coming to its feet, then the AIDS virus comes, and we are very honored here to have Dr. Robert Ball here, who was one of the heroes of this AIDS epidemic. And as I say in the book, if a straight, white, church-attending man, of impeccable Charleston lineage can get so crucified over treating people with HIV, imagine what it's like to be those people with HIV themselves. So the same thing happens, that happens everywhere. Victims are being blamed. Hospitals are not taking care of them. Physicians are not taking care of them. Families are not taking care of them. And a couple of 3 gay men get together in the city of Charleston. They start a group called Helping Hands, which incredibly mushrooms into a much larger group. And eventually Joe Hall, another dear friend who died too young, died during COVID, he becomes the head of the local AIDS agency. And believe it or not, so this is in the 80s, there is debate, can an out gay man lead an agency? Are people going to give money to it? And there's a wonderful oral history with Joe, and he basically proves that it does. It's the first LGBTQ organization to get United funding, and in his oral history, he says, yes, we showed the city of Charleston that, yes, effing gay men with tons of lesbians. He says, lesbians, they are the core volunteers of that, yes, that we can take care of our straight brothers and sisters, our black brothers and sisters, et cetera. It's a really, really moving oral history. And so then, we finally come out of that, and again, it's institutions. And so bringing us up quicker to the present, next slide. So We Are Family is founded in 1995. Again, people here may know of Tom Myers, very distinguished straight man, who, again, impeccable lineage. His son was having issues being picked on at school for being gay, and Tom did not just want to help his own son. He tried to help all LGBTQ children in the city of Charleston. And that really astonished people like Charlie Smith and Linda Kettner, who were once, I don't know if they're still members of the church, when they came to Charleston and they saw that a straight man could not get in trouble for dealing with gay youth, they realized that the tide had turned in the city of Charleston. So We Are Family is still ongoing. And before AFA was founded, the next slide, then for about a 10-year period, we had the Low Country Gay and Lesbian Alliance, which put out newsletters, which did lots of events. They did do pushback. They did against some politicians. They did pride marches. Not pride marches. They did pride events like at James Island, that kind of thing. But they were still conflicted. There was still the debate in that group if you could come out. If you could, if you look at their newsletters, people are just signing it with their first names. This was still when you could be fired for being gay, lose your housing, lose your family, et cetera, like that. So there was this tension within this group. And Linda Kettner talks about going to one of these meetings, and she's really sad. Linda Kettner has been a closeted philanthropist in the city of Charleston, and she goes to one of these meetings, and she's unhappy that people aren't out and proud. And she says if she wants to, if she's going to come out, she's going to come out of the closet door blazing. So she says she doesn't actually know gay people. She talks to Tom Myers. Tom Myers puts her in touch with people who Charlie Smith, Linda Moldenhauer, Jim and Warren Redmond Gress, and they're the ones who eventually come up with the Alliance for Full Acceptance. And that's the next slide. And and they do incredible things with PR. They put billboards up on the highways. They do TV spots. They do, they take on the city police force on their, quizzing people, their prospective employees if they've ever had gay sex and stuff like that. And that is still the civil rights organization going. And I'm going to end with one other slide. So the one other person who brings it up to where I end the book, 2010, Lynn Dugan. Lynn Dugan grows up in New York City. She's just too young to have known the Stonewall people, but she eventually does get to know the Stonewall people. She has this peripatetic life. She comes to South Carolina. She meets Charlie Smith at a gay pride parade in Columbia, which has been going on in the 1990s. She comes to Charleston. She founds the Women's Social Club for Lesbians, the Les Guide, the Les Fest. But she, for the very first time, what she sees, this community has gone through a whole lot. Everything bringing LGBTQ people together has always been for a cause. It's been to fight AIDS. It's been for marriage equality. It's been for, adjudicated youth or something. She finally realizes that the community is is evolved enough that it can just have its own gay pride parade. It does not have to go to elsewhere in the state. And so then one can just celebrate being gay. One doesn't have to fight being gay, and there always will be battles. But she brings the pride parade to the city of Charleston. First, the city of North Charleston, because the city of Charleston will not let it go down the center of the street. It always wants the parade to be on East Bay Street, literally on the margins of the city where the LGBTQ community has done it. Lynn is not going to accept that. She actually gets North Charleston to allow her to do it. In 2014, it finally comes here. And the point that I want to make is that her parade goes into the heart of the city and into the history of the city. And the point that I want to make is that as that history, we have been here all along. Before I say thank you for listening, I want to say one other thing, is that I dedicated this book to all the people whose stories I could tell and all the people whose stories I could not tell. But there's also dedication to the people who made this possible. And sitting in this church are a number of people who contributed financially to making this possible. This all started out, I work at the College of Charleston. It's all been done with grant funds, and it's all been done, I will say, on the kindness of strangers and on the kindness of friends. And yes, Tennessee Williams did draft that first line, the kindness of strangers, in the Fort Sumter Hotel when he was here writing Streetcar Named Desire. But what I want to do and end on that is, I know y'all are here. Don't be shy. I would love for all of those who did donate to this cause, that make all of my research possible, please stand up. And I would like to give y'all a round of applause. So y'all stand up. So, if people want to run fleeing in the street, I understand that, but if people want to ask some questions, I'd be glad to do that as well too. And I think there'll be a social time as well. So I will defer to you, Adam, as the master of ceremonies as to what we should do.
Can you say a little bit about what you're doing in the archive at the...
Sure. So, and I'll try to be brief. So, I'd worked in the elite white archives, I'd worked in the Jewish archives, I'd worked in the black archives, and a graduate student walked into the special collections a few years ago wanting to document LGBTQ history for a historic preservation thing was. And it hit me, no one had ever documented that, and again, here I am, a gay man, never tended to my own people. So that prompted me to write grants that allowed us to hire full-time people. We did oral histories. Many people here have done oral histories. Where do you get all this granular information, especially in the 20th century? You get it from these oral histories of people telling you what they did. It also allowed us to actually collect materials, buy materials. You saw that 1850s daguerreotype of Charlotte Myers Griswold. So now all of a sudden the college does also have, if you come there, yes, you can study Jewish people, you can study whatever, you can study LGBTQ people as well too. So that's the program they're doing. But without any of this research, I did not set out to write this book, but it was once all this stuff came in and a publisher approached me saying, will you do it? Then I realized, well, it might be possible. And that all changed in the last couple of years, thanks to the generosity of the people in this room. There was another question in the back row, was that, or, but.
Will you be signing books here or next door?
Will I be signing books here or next door?
The books are here.
I mean, right, so I will stay here if you want me to sign them here, but then I'll go, but I defer to y'all. Okay, so there'll be more elbow room. Yeah. Well, I really do thank you all. This has been my maiden voyage out, so truly, thanks for being such a wonderful audience.
Thank you so much for coming. Our next lecture will be February 12th. It will be by Mr. Brad Erickson, who is a parishioner at St. Stephen's. It will be on spirituality and theater and how those two things intersect. There are many people who are St. Stephenites here. If you are not from St. Stephen's, there will be many people that can direct you to Stevens Hall for the reception, but please do purchase a book if you're interested.